In the mid-90s, Metal Gear seemed like a relic of the past, tied to the 8-bit generation. It was one of the franchises from Konami's MSX team that would not transition over to the 16-bit consoles. After finishing up Metal Gear 2 for the MSX, the team split up to join other divisions. The series director, Hideo Kojima, began tutoring new recruits, heading new divisions to finally return to actual game development. Policenauts would be his first new game project in the 90s, an adventure game in the spirit of Snatcher. Production on Policenauts wrapped up in 1994, and the team continued with a port for the 3DO. It was in this period that Metal Gear would become top priority again for Kojima. It was an era of massive shifts within the industry. For one, polygonal graphics seemed to be the way forward. This was something embraced by Kojima in his vision of moving the franchise into the new generation of gaming. When he began writing the main storyline, one of the first members involved was the concept artist Yoji Shinkawa. Shinkawa had just joined Konami and was still struggling to find his place in the company. Other than some scattered design tasks for Policenauts, he didn't have an assigned project to work on. The new Metal Gear presented him with a perfect opportunity, as Kojima's design team was still focused on porting Policenauts. As with the previous game in the series, the first task was to visualize the new nuclear battle tank, now named Metal Gear Rex. Kojima's vision for Rex was to make it a believable war machine that at the same time felt alive once piloted. After some initial sketching, he began constructing a scale model using clay. It made it easier to better represent the 3D design compared to drawing it with pencil and paper. The final design was a bipedal tank with a dinosaur-like quality. Rex had a far more agile look compared to the older, bulky Metal Gear models. Particularly the powerful legs and use of straight lines made it look more modern and menacing. Rex was recreated as a 3D model by Kumi Sato, a 3D artist on the Policenauts team. It was among the first images to show up in promotional footage. With the new Rex design approved, Shinkawa began to visualize Kojima's scenario, fleshing out the main characters and locations. He preferred to use brush pens, a tool that shares the dynamic and unpredictable qualities of a regular brush. This quick medium gave him the freedom to maximize his creative flow. Not worrying about details allowed him to put the visions popping into his mind directly onto paper. And this matters greatly for a concept artist, to explore interesting and creative ideas while the project is still in its most nimble and shapeable form. Shinkawa was inspired by illustrator Yoshikazu Yasuhiko, who drew his manga Arion using brush pens. It made Shinkawa aware of the potential of this medium. Another defining inspiration in his early teens were Franco-Belgian comics, particularly the works of Enki Bilal, who went for a more mature tone and art style within the rich European comic book scene. This influence outside of the Japanese mainstream shaped Shinkawa as an artist and his distinct use of color. At this early phase of pre-production, Kojima's team were situated in a temporary office. Shinkawa, however, would rarely show up and preferred to work remotely from home. He would meet up with Kojima in more creatively stimulating places to discuss his ideas. Pre-production on the new Metal Gear started in the second half of 1994 and continued into 1995. However, the 3DO port of Policenauts was still in full production and was often priority for the staff. This would shift after Policenauts hit the market in September that year. By this time, the 3DO already had major competition from the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. The 3D capabilities of the PlayStation had impressed Kojima, seeing it as the perfect platform to realize his vision. The new Metal Gear project would demand a team of specialists in fields from animation to 3D modeling to concept design, professions that weren't so specified in the generation before. A lot of new faces on the team, combined with the fact that it would be Kojima's first true 3D polygon game, made the task of coordination even more important. Assistant director Yoshikazu Matsuhana would therefore be a pivotal member of the team. A still compact development crew began to give Kojima's ideas shape, making it possible for him to test and play with game concepts in isolation. These were done on SGI machines with Softimage as the leading 3D package. It quickly allowed them to simulate game scenarios before the core 3D engine was implemented. An early consideration was the camera system. After some experimentation, they quickly established the overhead viewpoint for the core gameplay. It allowed the players to quickly respond to avoid enemy attacks or engage in combat. The viewpoint also resembled the MSX titles, making the transition to 3D a little smoother. During specific sequences, the camera switched to an alternative view to heighten the suspense. These early proof of concepts would be showcased to the public in a 1996 trailer. They would simulate some of the envisioned stealth gameplay and overall feel of this new entry that was now branded Metal Gear Solid. Early in 1996, the team finally moved out of their temporary location. Their new office in Tokyo had all the necessary facilities to fully ramp up production, having access to a top-of-the-line challenge render server and plenty of SGI workstations. They began implementing the proof of concepts on the actual hardware and fleshed out the full game. With a core staff of 25, the team was considerably larger than the previous entries, but individual members could still have a great sense of ownership. Successfully transitioning 2D franchises to this 3D generation was a major struggle for game designers in the mid-90s. With Metal Gear Solid, however, they didn't have to completely reinvent the gameplay thanks to its top-down viewpoint. The second entry in particular provided a rich source to draw from sneaking through ventilation shafts and meeting a female spy in the lavatory, to temperature-sensitive keys. Due to its limited release, Metal Gear 2 was enjoyed by a relatively small group of MSX enthusiasts. Recycling these game elements would therefore still feel fresh for most of the audience, and the new technology available made it possible for Kojima to fully realize his vision for Metal Gear. The freedom to switch to different camera angles greatly boosted the feeling of immersion. For instance, limiting the player to first person in specific situations added tension. Like the previous Metal Gear games, the goal was to package the gameplay as a coherent story. A simple mission structure was therefore not sufficient. All the objectives for players should feel logical in context to the story. An added challenge for Kojima was to make it work as a sequel, as well as an entry point for those new to the series.
You knew? We've had a couple of run-ins in the past.
Like his previous projects, Metal Gear Solid would have an extensive script with hours of dialogue. With the help of a military advisor and the necessary research, he was able to deliver a convincing tone, touching subjects ranging from DNA and world politics to the arms industry. The mature tone of the script and visuals made it appealing to an older age group. This perfectly aligned with the trend of targeting this older demographic within the industry.
You wanted to follow in your father's footsteps?
Not really. I thought that if I became a soldier, I could understand him better. Truth is, I was just afraid of looking at myself, afraid of having to make my own decisions in life.
This isn't a training exercise. Our lives are riding on this. There are no heroes or heroines.
Snake.
The Metal Gear series had cinema in its DNA from the start. The new generation of hardware allowed Kojima to push that quality even further. Dynamic, real-time cutscenes with voice acting would replace the text dialogue of the two preceding games.
You should crawl on the ground like the snake you are.
This cinematic approach to game development required extensive conceptual design. Concept artist Shinkawa therefore remained a key member during production. The design of Metal Gear Solid flowed from the desire to make it feel grounded in realism while still adding a creative, stylistic touch. For one thing, the game would be set in the near future. They used existing technology as a starting point and slightly pushed its capabilities to make a believable world for the player. Machinery and buildings were all thought through from an engineering standpoint. The range of outfits were also designed in detail according to the specialty of the character. On the other hand, they also allowed a dose of creative freedom when it came to portraying characters, sometimes favoring stylistic outfits over practicality in a cold Arctic environment. When walking this fine line between style and realism, it was essential that players still bought into the believability of the story and its characters. This melding of style and realism also shaped Snake's outfit. Early in pre-production, Snake wore a blue camo uniform. The opening scene of the game, however, made the creatives consider an advanced watertight suit, taking cues from the contemporary Batman movies. The high-tech suit was stylish and yet still believable to the player. He could function under the cold Arctic temperatures without having to wear thick Arctic gear. As an artist, Shinkawa first explores ideas in rough form. Subsequently, he scanned some of his work into computer to do quick color renditions using Painter. Painter's watercolor function still gave the work the analog touch and preserved the rough pencil quality. Shinkawa designed the characters without concerning himself too much with video game limitations. It was up to the 3D artist to translate his designs with the limited number of polygons. The essence of Shinkawa's art style actually translated well to the strict hardware limitations of the PlayStation. Mainly relying on shadows to provide detail to the characters' faces gave the player the freedom to fill in the blanks. There was an abstraction that made it work with the overall tone, and was a clever way to hide the limitations of detail and expression.
Can you shoot me, rookie?
Careful, I'm no rookie.
Liar. That nervous glance, that scared look in your eyes. They're rookies' eyes if I ever saw them.
8 CG artists were assigned to create over 1,000 3D models needed for the game. Each artist had their own specialty and were thus given their own stage aligning with their skills. Some excelled at buildings, others at natural environments. Photographs served as the main reference for the outdoor scenery. The indoor set pieces, on the other hand, were sketched out in detail by Shinkawa. He would sometimes sit next to a CG artist to provide his art direction when translating them to 3D. Metal Gear Solid was a more compact experience, its setting taking place in generally confined spaces compared to other 3D games of that era. They could therefore dedicate a decent chunk of the texture RAM to individual rooms, resulting in more believable environments with a greater level of detail. It also had the benefit of not having to worry about the draw distance. With some clever trickery, they were even able to simulate effects like reflection. Kojima had initially drawn 2D maps on graph paper, but these turned out to be useless in this new era of 3D. They turned to a more suitable method of conceptualizing 3D spaces: Lego. Lego models detailed with enemies and furniture gave the director a better feel for the locations. Using a tiny Sony video camera, he could move around the models and view it on a monitor. These sets formed the bases for the actual in-game locations. It was an easy and hands-on way for the director to test his ideas without having to wait for production. These seemingly simple solutions were key in keeping the planning nimble in this new era when game productions were becoming more complex. Game maps were implemented via their in-house tool called Space. It provided them the toolset to interactively create rooms, but also implement camera locations and enemy behavior, like the patrol routes. Its graphic interface made it possible for members outside the programming team to add these gameplay aspects themselves. Set pieces were all built from very crude geometry to fit within the polygon budget. Textures were key in providing any form of detail. By incorporating shading into the textures, a flat plane could give the impression of 3D geometry. Textures were therefore pivotal in shaping how the graphics looked. Rather than relying on neutral, repeatable textures, the artist on Metal Gear went for a more distinct look. They added wear and dirt and also simulated how the objects would look in these low-light environments. It resulted in a consistent look that blended photorealism with a more painted art style. Many of the hardware limitations meant this graphical work still had a lot in common with the 16-bit generation. The team used 4-bit paletted textures, meaning 16 different shades stored in an external color palette. Textures were then grouped together in sets called pages. It was up to the artist to make optimal use of a texture page and limit the number necessary for a specific area. The strong use of shading in the level design was a key element in the game's art direction. Some areas were intentionally quite dark to support the overall mood and game experience. Within entertainment and art in general, it's imperative to have an understanding of light and how its absence can contribute to the overall image. Lighting on the PlayStation was generally simulated instead of being defined by actual real-time calculated light sources. A powerful technique the developers applied was to define shading with vertex color data. It essentially means altering the color of specific points of a 3D model to manually paint shadows and highlights. The PlayStation was able to blend this color data with the applied textures to create the final look. A trick they also used was adding a vignette effect in certain areas to further emphasize the cramped and gritty feel. Another aspect of the art direction of Metal Gear Solid was its color scheme. In great contrast to the generally colorful look of Japanese media, the game would have an almost duotone look. The locales each had their own color tone matching with the atmosphere. Blue and green hues communicated a cold and desolate atmosphere. This would be in great contrast to the warmer and more pleasant tones of the ending sequence. Meryl's bright orange life vest would further add vibrancy to the scene. When it came to implementation, they used the same technique as with the shading. The overall color tone was stored in the 3D models and blended with the applied textures. The game's distinct duotone art style still came with its challenges in those days. For one, the limited number of shades available. Similar to most PlayStation titles, the game runs in a reduced color space to boost performance. The PlayStation's dithering function was key to simulate more shades. Aside from the color scheme, various frame buffer effects also enhanced the cinematic feel. Altering the rendered image inside the console's memory made it possible to simulate motion blur and even depth of field. The cinematic design and stylistic use of color, textures, and lighting made Metal Gear Solid really stand out. It was uncommon to have such a distinct and coherent vision throughout the whole graphics pipeline, from the character design down to the stylish graphic design of the game's interface and logo. Much like the visual side of the production, music would also be held to the same high standard. The team of composers made use of atmospheric synths to set a desolate mood, combined with aggressive percussion for that industrial undertone. Another aspect of production the game could distinguish itself in was animation. Having 3D characters and environments meant unmatched freedom compared to the pixel art era. 3D animation was still a relatively new field to explore for Kojima's team, and thus the search began to find talent in this field. Luckily, Shinkawa was friends with freelance animator So Toyota, who joined Konami in May of '96 when the game was hitting full production. Toyota's character animation impressed Kojima and put an end to the idea of utilizing motion capture on this project.
Make me feel alive again.
Toyota as motion director would set the tone of the project's animation style and be responsible for the movements of the main cast. In order to blend style with realism, he consulted the project's military advisor Motosada Mori. There were a total of 6 animators on the team, each with their own specialty. One had worked on Gundam and helped out animating Rex, while another artist animated all the animals. It was a specialism to add believable dynamics to their movements and made these low-poly models feel alive. When it came to the cutscenes, Shinkawa and Toyota storyboarded Kojima's scenarios up front. The team was able to tackle the massive task of animating all scenes in 6 months. Along with Softimage, they also used an in-house developed tool called Polygonomy, bridging the gap between the animation package and the game's engine. It helped them animate characters to the dialogue, for instance. It was also the main tool for implementing the dynamic camera movements and animating various objects in the cutscenes.
You were lucky. We'll meet again. Who are you? I like you. I have no name.
Despite the storage capacity of CD-ROM, limitations of a console's RAM continued to be a puzzle for programmers. Snake's motion alone takes up about 150 kilobytes in RAM, as much as the audio data. Fast compression algorithms were necessary to squeeze it all into the runtime memory. The scenes with Rex, Snake, and the ninja in particular demanded a large amount of motion data. Kazunobu Uehara was in charge of programming and created the main system. A major task for the team was creating the various tools to streamline production, ranging from data conversion and texture utilities to 3D model viewers, to extensive programs like space and polygonomy. These all greatly helped the directors and artists implement and tweak various elements of the game themselves. After almost a year and a half of full production, the team began to ready themselves for launch. A full trailer with orchestrated in-engine shots gave the audience an awesome impression of the final gameplay. It led to growing anticipation around the game. Concept artist Shinkawa, meanwhile, worked on images for publicity purposes, ranging from magazine covers to the final box art. After being delayed for almost a year, Metal Gear Solid finally hit the market in 1998. Despite the project being started 4 years earlier, it was still a truly cutting-edge experience. When pre-production on Metal Gear Solid began, 3D gaming was still a novelty in mainstream gaming. It was forward-thinking of the creatives to push the artistic craft of the game and not merely rely on the novelty of 3D to breathe life into the franchise. Metal Gear Solid was more than a successful transition for the franchise to 3D. It was among the top of the industry in quality of animation, art direction, and sophisticated storytelling with cinematic flair.
Sun is a shield.